So let's talk through the armies that perhaps make up the central middle of the pack in Warhammer 40k. Maybe the forces and factions that have claim to fame at being the most balanced in the game against their peers. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where over the past week or so we've talked about some of the strongest factions in the game and some of the weakest. In this video though, I thought we'd talk through the armies that seem to fall into neither category right now, maybe in a good spot game balance wise, at least against their peers, maybe not necessarily entirely internally within their faction. I'll link those videos to the strongest and weakest armies in Warhammer 40k down in the video description, but seeing as we talked about 10 factions each with both of those, that leaves us 6 left out of the 26 major factions of Warhammer 40k, and I thought it would be rude to leave them out altogether, so let's round up what they can do now. For gauging which factions might be some of the better balanced ones in 40k, there's a few different ways that you can look at it, as we've done with the other videos. I do quite like tournament win percentage as just a rough and ready metric, that is how many games the average player with the army is winning with them after all. It does have limitations against not necessarily showing high level play or anything like that. So for context, we'll also talk about wins at big events and the faction play rate at big tournaments, another thing that definitely goes up or down depending on how good they are. Overall in 40k, I'd broadly rate game balance as fairly good right now. As we'll talk about in the Honourable Mentions, there's a whole load of factions that really aren't too far from the middle either. At least compared with plenty of times in 40k's past, the outliers just aren't really that bad too. Maybe some of these middle win rate armies could definitely use a little bit of internal balance though. There's definitely still some forces that struggle to use certain elements of their list, maybe things like Chaos Knights with their Titanic Knights and Orks with their Dagger units. First up, let's just mention some honourable mentions. It seems that the middle 6 armies that I'm talking about today rank between 47 and 49% win rate, and if you extend those bounds just by a little bit, 2% on either side, that does encompass a whole load of other factions in the game. At least by my last video, Eldari and Drukhari are around about 50% wins, Grey Knights and Demons around 51. Guard Blood Angels, Genestealer Cult and World Eaters were on 46, and Tyranids and Dark Angels on 45. I feel like you might start to get some noticeable differences between the factions on the extremes of those win rates, say the 45% ones playing the 51% ones, but for the most part I feel like player skill is just a much bigger issue compared with the raw faction strength out of these. At least for the vast majority of these, I feel like a skilled player playing their list well will generally beat an unskilled player, even if they happen to be playing against an army that is just a few percentage points up on the chart. Getting into these main 6 though, and first up we have the Orks. They're getting tournament win rates around about 47% at the moment, an amount that actually does represent a fair enough drop compared with their previous performance. In the balanced data slate they did see some points changes to a few of their better units, Squig Hogboys, Knobs and Trucks being some of them, and they do seem to have hit the faction kind of hard. They've won 2 big tournaments since the balanced data slate, which isn't really a massively impressive number given that they're one of the more popular armies in the game. 8th most played at tournaments, Orks generally seem to turn out in good numbers no matter how their army is doing. The Greenskins definitely still have plenty of scary threats to put on the board though. The core of their list often still tends to get made up of some of these scary melee things jumping out of transports, Knobs and boys led by war bosses, maybe Beast Snagger boys or Mega Knobs, often jumping out of either trucks or battle wagons. Squig Hog boys certainly feel far less standout now they went up in points, though I still say that they're usable and you might still find them being led by that knob with the kill chopper. Otherwise, for some raw might, the Beast Boss on the Squigosaur and Mozrog Scragbad are both fairly terrifying combatants, really hard to take down and hit hard in melee. Captain Badrock pulling out of a transport with a whole bunch of flash gits does well. Really quite general and scary Orc firepower for a turn or two, and then to help with scoring things, Gretchen are nice to camp objectives and generate you command points, and Storm Boys are pretty good for jumping around the board doing secondaries or maybe skirmishing with lighter infantry. On the turn where all that is about to make melee, you can call the War for invulnerable saves and a massively powerful melee punch, big melee damage, and also advance and charge. They get sustained hits worn in combat, and they've got quite a nice -1 to wound stratagem, which is particularly good on the Squig Hogs or the Squigosaurs. For Orky weaknesses at the moment, I'd say that perhaps the Dagger units being just generally overcosted isn't that great for them. Most of the buggies cost a bit more for what they do than they really should, I think, even more so for the planes, and the walkers aren't really so hot either, despite certain reductions like the killer cans. In particular, tough things with 2+ saves can really cause issue for Orks. Most of their attacks are either low or middling AP at best, and they can struggle with certain big tough unit matchups, not doing very well against, say, things like Chaos Knights. The war can sometimes be a little bit predictable if you're going second, seeing as your opponent will know it's coming. Might just be able to set up a little bit better to mitigate the impact. And Orcs are a faction that maybe feel like they have some bad matchups, as well as things like Chaos Knights. Death Guard seem to do quite well against them, their attrition warfare being quite nice against Orky low saves with their contagions. And Custodians are generally quite strong as a sort of counter melee faction, given the access to fights first when they need it. Overall, between all that, it does feel like the Orcs maybe aren't quite as strong as they were a few months back. They're still certainly capable of putting some scary stuff on the board and some big melee. Certainly not standout strong, though I feel like they're not really quite in the place where they're struggling as much as some factions in the game. Hopefully their upcoming codex will add some interesting extra value. Speaking of Death Guard, their win rates are around about 49%. They seem to be doing quite well for tournament performance, with 5 big wins since the balanced data slate. And on the competitive scene, they're one of the more played factions at the moment. Lots of people looking forward to putting the Sons of Mortarion on the tabletop, the 6th most played army of the 26 factions. At the moment, Death Guard feel like they're really quite a solid and balanced army overall. The vast majority of their army feels really quite strong, whether it's things like Death Shroud Terminators with multiple strong leader options, putting the smackdown in combat with those scythes, or maybe a bunch of heavily armed Plague Marines piling out of Rhinos alongside a Biologist Putrefier or a Foul Blightspawn, dousing the enemy with a whole bunch of mortal wounds from those grenades. For other strong units, Typhus maybe feels like he's the single most standout unit for the points out of the entire index. Massive mortal wound damage, and a generally dangerous melee profile on top of that. Plagueburst Crawlers and Bloat Drones both are very effective for the cost from the Demon engines. Mortarian's usable, and that ignores modifiers, can be pretty good against certain opponents, and Allied Nurglings can help out in a pinch for screening or secondary objectives. For their supporting rules, they get their stacking durability debuffs from the Contagions, a -1 toughness, and boosting your AP against the targets by 1. Unless you happen to be against an enemy with very low saves or invulnerables, and it might make more sense for the -1 to hit. Otherwise, the sustained hits 2 in melee is quite a powerful combat stratagem if you happen to be on an objective where you can trigger it. Overall, I'd say that the Death Guard are in a pretty good place at the moment. For army weaknesses, they do generally tend to be at least fairly slow moving once they're on the board, particularly things like Death Shroud Terminators once they've deep struck in, and the range on many of their better attacks is kind of small. For underpowered units in the army, the Blight Lord Terminators still remain kind of badly balanced versus the Death Shroud, most people preferring the small increase per model for the massive more melee damage, and maybe the Noxious Blightbringer and Plague Surgeon feel a bit undertuned out of the support characters. It maybe does feel a bit odd that the durability is good, but maybe not quite to the crazy levels that it's been in the past. I'd kind of rate Death Guard as fairly tough, but maybe not exceptionally so. It does still feel a bit weird that they don't have any sort of disgustingly resilient type rule. In any case though, they still seem to be a faction that's doing really quite well, winning tournaments, loads of people seem to be excited to play them and put them on the table, and tournament win rates that seem to be pretty well balanced. Good players can definitely do well with them against the toughest stuff around. Next up, we've got the Spiky Knights with the Forces of Chaos, also on tournament wins around 49%, 2 big tournament wins since the balanced data slate, and again at least a fairly popular faction, 9th most played out of the 26 armies. It seems that Games Workshop still haven't really managed to get the balance between big knights and small knights right, despite the points cuts on the Titanic Knights. War Dogs still seem to be massively overrepresented in tournament lists in a big way. Mainly War Dog Carnivores for some ferocious melee, and War Dog Brigands for some big firepower. The Huntsman and Stalker, more balanced War Dogs, are both absolutely fine as well. Out of Titanic Knights for their Chaos, it seems to be the Chaos Knight Lancer that seems to have made the most tournament success recently. I guess a massive great big scary melee monster of a knight with the 4+ invulnerable save for close combat can cause some massive problems. It's also a bit less likely to be screened out by enemies given that you've got the stratagem to move through walls if desperately needed. Allied Chaos Demons seem at least fairly popular as well, particularly Nurglings, though they do have some interesting uses for some of the others as well. Nurglings do seem to be great just for cheap support though, screening and dropping in to do those secondaries. For their supporting rules, they get the big Battle Shock debuffs, -1 to tests, and also making enemies test if they happen to have taken any damage. It maybe does depend on the sort of army that you're playing against as to whether or not that's actually meaningful. Sometimes it can be really big on objectives. Some armies aren't really going to care very much. For stratagems, you've got useful things like the Diabolic Bulwark and that Walk Through Wall stratagem, or the ability to throw some damage around with Terror Shades on a failed Battle Shock. There's a rather nice AP debuff one as well that can be quite nice on a big knight like a Tyrant if you happen to be taking one. For Knight army lists, they still generally tend to have some fairly obvious weaknesses. Anything with big anti-tank is going to be bad news for them. They might just be a bit predictable with what they're going to try and do to try and win the game, just stomp forward and wipe out the enemies for the most part. For the Chaos Knights, their battle shock can be pretty unreliable and swingy. Sometimes it's going to be absolutely massive, though in some games your opponent might just make those important tests. And it still does seem a shame that the Titanic Knights just aren't really commonly played on the competitive scene at all, even if they are a fair bit more balanced against the War Dogs than they were prior to the points changes. Also, around about 49% wins are the Imperial Knights. They're an army that rose up a fair bit in terms of raw win percentage at least since the data slate, getting points cuts on the vast majority of their Titanic Knights, and also a nice boost to their rerolls from Lay Low the Tyrants, going from only being limited to using those on ones to just getting one flat hit and wound each time you attack. As with the Chaos Knights though, it doesn't really seem to have massively translated into actual big tournament wins. Their play rate seems to be kind of middling at like around 13th most played out of 26, though quite close to some others. For the Imperial Knights, there feels like there's maybe a little bit more choice for different units to support in the army, though there do seem to be just two choices that tend to get taken the most. Armature Warglaives still seem to be the go-to for the front line, particularly with bigger rerolls happening now, often tending to take lots of those, maybe a smaller amount of Helverins to cover the home field and provide some longer fire support. The Helverins can be kind of good against Catan as well. Otherwise, out of the Titanic Knights, Canis Rex maybe stands out the most. He just outcompetes quite a lot of the other bigger knights just with the raw damage with all those massive sustained hits happening. Though quite a lot of the other Titanic knights I think are usable enough, maybe the Lancer, Errant, Warden, Crusader and Castellan maybe coming up a little bit more than some others in competitive lists that I've seen lately. Generally supporting the knights will be assassins and inquisitorial henchmen. The Calidus is quite nice for jumping around doing objectives, and henchmen can be quite good just for cheap little nuisance units to either do secondaries or camp primaries for super cheap. Compared with the Chaos Knights battle shocks, the Imperials just get built-in raw might. I feel no pain of 6+, and an inbuilt hit and wound reroll from Lay Low the Tyrants. Then a big boost usually if you slay the enemy warlord, making the feel no pain better and granting CP. Otherwise, rotating ion shields is a staple. There's a few fun damage dealer stratagems, and Mysterious Guardian can be kind of big for a single big teleport move by a knight. Getting something like a Castellan or Crusader line of sight on its intended prey can be massive. As with the Chaos Knights, anything that does excessive anti-tank damage isn't going to be bad news for them. They do give up Bring It Down fairly easily as well. Again, they're a bit more predictable like the Chaos Knights, and don't have quite as much scope for clever tricks. They do tend to be an army that tends to do quite a lot better in casual versus competitive games. They'll dislike terrain a bit more than the Chaos with no option to go ghosting through those walls. And maybe for criticisms of individual units, the Valiant and the Preceptor feel like some of the most overshadowed ones right now. The Valiant didn't like losing Overwatch, and the Preceptor feels pretty redundant versus Canis Rex. In general, it doesn't seem to be too bad for them for pure win rate at least. They're still certainly a challenge to the majority of players, though perhaps aren't an army that tend to get to really big tops of tournaments or things. Space Wars next, and for the Leaguers of Votann, they've also got a win rate around about 49%, 3 big tournaments wins since the balanced data slate, and they do seem to be lesser played than they were around about that time, 16th most played out of 26, having taken a few choice nerfs in the update, things like Sagittars and Hearthguard and Thunderkin all going up. The Leagues of Votann don't exactly have an enormous unit roster, but out of those, I'd say maybe the Einhir Hearthguard really still stand out as one of their best units, dropping in and then frying the enemy with a whole bunch of devastating wounds and blast grenade launchers, maybe following up with a charge if they're lucky. The vehicles are fairly efficient in land fortresses and scouting Sagittars. Hernkin Pioneers are good, most of the characters solid enough. I'd say maybe out of the more battle line sort of units, the Hearthkin Warriors and the Chthonian Berserks maybe seem a little bit more borderline, not unusable, but not standout either. The core of their army centers around those judgment tokens, getting a big +1 to hit and wound on 4 units at the start of the game, maybe more for slain units, or if you've got Carls to hand them out. Lots of command points when they're done, and they do have some very good stratagems in their index. A few nice damage dealers, including a big sustained hits one, plus their void armor to help keep one unit extra safe. For weaknesses and downsides, they can be somewhat slow when their foot troops are on the board, maybe the Hearthguard more than most there. The Judgment rule can be a little bit on the swingy side. It's going to be great against any armies where you can mark a huge amount of their army by picking 4 units If you've got more sort of multiple small unit sort of enemies, it won't matter quite so much. Maybe like the Knights as well, they don't really seem to be an army that has a huge amount of clever tricks or depth to their index compared with some. They generally need to play around out damaging the opponent and blasting them off the board. Often they can do that, but again I maybe feel that that's one of the reasons they don't seem to win quite as many tournaments, at least compared with some out there. Otherwise, having a smaller unit roster means they just don't have certain battlefield roles even if you want them. Things like infiltration units, for example, aren't a thing, though presumably those Hernkin Jaegers will fix that. And I guess for underpowered datasheets, Uthar the Destined doesn't really seem to be taken all that much, even if he does have some fun rules. Overall though, I still think they're in really quite a good place. Middle of the road in terms of win rates, but able to win the odd tournament when they need to. And maybe their index just a little bit better internally balanced after the latest round of points changes. Finally, in our look at the middle tier armies of Warhammer 40k, we have the Space Wolves. Win rates are around about 49%, 2 big tournament wins since the balanced data state. They're far less played than quite a few of the other armies on this list, a competitive play rate quite niche at around about 21st out of 26 armies. I feel like Space Wolves do tend to be down towards the lower end of play rates normally anyway. I can't help but think that maybe part of that's due to them generally wanting to operate with quite a specific list at the moment. Lots of Thunderwolves out there more so than other things. Speaking of which, Thunderwolf Cavalry does seem to be the way that Space Wolf get things done at the moment. Really quite big and tanky models for just 30 points, moving fairly fast and fairly general purpose melee damage on the charge with that +1 damage rule, plus really good characters to back them up like Wolf Lords, Harold, and Wolfguard battle leaders. Since the small but powerful errata that buffed Wolfen as well, they've had their hammers improved from damage 1 to damage 2, and now they genuinely have some really quite scary stats for the 80-point cost, even if they do come with the fairly big weakness of not doing primary objectives. Fenrisian Wolves are handy enough to have along to screen and score for cheap, quite nice to have them move fast. And perhaps some other more standout unique stuff is Logan Grimnar for the big rerolls in the charge and fight phase, Bjorn the Fell-Handed, who's just quite a powerful dreadnought all around. And I do quite like Ulrich the Slayer backed up by Bloodclaws. They just seem like really quite a nice and surprisingly fighty melee unit for the points cost, and fairly tanky given the number of bodies as well. At the moment, Space Wolves do best in the Stormlance Task Force, the sort of White Scar style detachment. It really helps out their Thunderwolves, given that they've got the mounted keyword. Advance and charge is pretty helpful, and they've got some nice maneuverability, speed, and damage stratagems to back that up. Probably the biggest weakness for the Space Wolves at the moment is their actual unique detachment. The Champions of Rust just remains very underpowered and not really played competitively. It's just too swingy with activating those sagas, and a lot of them are kind of opponent dependent. If they avoid them, then you just might not trigger them. Most of the other power armor variants I'd say are kind of okay, though not really standout. And Space Marines did take some nerfs in the last balance update, some points increases to other staples like Inceptors and Scouts that they often relied on for objective scoring, though both of those units do remain playable and good. Overall, I feel like Space Wolves are in a bit of a weird place as an army. They certainly can be strong, though they do really have just their one main build that they tend to use. I feel like Gladius and Ironstorm both aren't terrible really, though it is really a shame that their unique and more fluffy detachment isn't quite as good. In any case, we'll leave that there for that one. Feel free to share any other insights of your experiences playing any of the factions, and if you wanted to see any of the other factions discussed in a similar manner, I'll leave the links to my top 10 weakest and top 10 strongest armies down in the video description. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support and keep them coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.